house," she said, her eyes following the lines, and her feet moving in the direction of Mrs. Maldon. "Those burglaries are still going on. Hillport, now." "Oh, dear, dear," murmured Mrs. Maldon, as Rachel spread the newspaper lightly over the tea tray and its contents. "Oh, dear, dear. I do hope the police will catch someone soon. I'm sure they're doing their best, but really—" Rachel bent with confident intimacy over the old lady's shoulder, and they read the burglary column together, Rachel interrupting herself for an instant to pick up Mrs. Maldon's ball of black wool which had slipped to the floor. The signal reporter had omitted none of the classic clichés proper to the subject, and such words and phrases as "Jemmy," "effected an entrance," "the servant now thoroughly alarmed," "stealthy footsteps," "escaped with their booty," seriously disquieted both of the women, caused a sudden sensation of sinking in the region of the heart. Yet neither would put the secret fear into speech, for each by instinct felt that a fear once uttered is strengthened and made more real. Living solitary and unprotected by male sinews, in a house which, though it did not stand alone, was somewhat withdrawn from the town, they knew themselves the ideal prey of conventional burglars with masks, dark lanterns, revolvers, and jemmies. They were grouped together like some symbolic sculpture, and with all their fortitude and common sense, they still in unconscious attitude expressed the helpless and resigned fatalism of their sex before certain menaces of bodily danger, the thrilled expectant submission of women in a city about to be sacked. Nothing could save them if the peril entered the house, but they would not say aloud, "Suppose they came here, how terrible!" They would not even whisper the slightest apprehension. They just briefly discussed the matter with a fine air of indifferent aloofness, remaining calm while the brick walls and the social system which defended that bright and delicate parlour from the dark savage universe without seemed to crack and shiver. Mrs. Maldon, suddenly noticing that one blind was half an inch short of the bottom of the window, rose nervously and pulled it down further. "Why didn't you ask me to do that?" said Rachel, thinking what a fidgety person the old lady was. Mrs. Maldon replied, "It's all right, my dear. Did you fasten the window on the upstairs landing?" "As if burglars would try to get in by an upstairs window, and on the street!" thought Rachel, pityingly impatient. "However, it's her house, and I'm paid to do what I'm told," she added to herself, very sensibly. Then she said aloud, in a soothing tone, "No, I didn't, but I will do it." She moved towards the door, and at the same moment a knock on the front door sent a vibration through the whole house. Nearly all knocks on the front door shook the house, and further, burglars do not generally knock as a preliminary to effecting an entrance. Nevertheless, both women started, and were ashamed of starting. "Surely he's rather early," said Mrs. Maldon, with an exaggerated tranquillity. And Rachel, with a similar lack of conviction in her calm gait, went audaciously forth into the dark lobby. Part 5. On the glass panels of the front door, the street lamp threw a faint, distorted shadow of a bowler hat, two rather protruding ears, and a pair of long, outspreading whiskers, whose ends merged into broad shoulders. Any one familiar with the streets of Bursley would have instantly divined that Councillor Thomas Batchgrew stood between the gas lamp and the front door. And even Rachel, whose acquaintance with Bursley was still slight, at once recognised the outlines of the figure. She had seen Councillor Batchgrew one day conversing with Mrs. Maldon in Moorthorne Road, and she knew that he bore to Mrs. Maldon the vague but imposing relation of trustee. There are many, indeed perhaps too many, remarkable men in the Five Towns. Thomas Batchgrew was one of them. He had begun life as a small plumber in Bursley market-place, living behind and above the shop, and begetting a considerable family, which exercised itself in the backyard among empty and full turpentine cans. The original premises survived as a branch establishment, and Batchgrew's latest married grandson condescended to reside on the first floor, and to keep a motor car and a tricar in the backyard, now roofed over, in a manner not strictly conforming to the building by-laws of the borough. All Batchgrew's sons and daughters were married, and several of his grandchildren also, and all his children, and more than one of the grandchildren, kept motor cars. Not a month passed but some Batchgrew, or some Batchgrew's husband or child, bought a motor car, or sold one, or exchanged a small one for a larger one, or had an accident, or was gloriously fined in some distant part of the country for illegal driving. Nearly all of them had spacious detached houses, with gardens and gardeners, and patent slow combustion grates, and porcelain bathrooms comprising every appliance for luxurious splashing. And with the exception of one son, who had been assisted to Valparaiso in order that he might there seek death in the tankard without outraging the family, they were all teetotalers, because the old man, old Jack, was a teetotaler. The family pyramid was based firm on the old man, the numerous relatives held closely together like an alien oligarchical caste in a conquered country. If they ever did quarrel, it must have been in private. The principal seat of business, electrical apparatus, heating apparatus, and decorating and plumbing on a grandiose scale, in Hanbridge, had over its immense windows the sign John Batchgrew and Sons. The sign might well have read John Batchgrew and Sons, daughters, daughters-in-law, sons-in-law, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. The Batchgrew partners were always tendering for, and often winning, some big contract or other for heating and lighting and embellishing a public building or a mansion or manufactory. They by no means confined their activities to the Five Towns, having an address in London and another in Valparaiso. And small private customers were ever complaining of the inaccuracy of their accounts for small jobs. People who, in the age of Queen Victoria's earlier widowhood, had sent for Batchgrew to repair a burst spout, still by force of habit sent for Batchgrew to repair a burst spout, and still had to call at Batchgrew's about mistakes in the bills, which mistakes, after much argument and asseveration, were occasionally put right. In spite of their prodigious expenditures, and of a certain failure on the part of the public to understand where all the money came from, the financial soundness of the Batchgrews was never questioned. In discussing the Batchgrews, no bank manager and no lawyer had ever by an intonation or a movement of the eyelid hinted that earthquakes had occurred before in the history of the world, and might occur again. And yet old Batchgrew, admittedly the cleverest of the lot, save possibly the Valparaiso soaker, could not be said to attend assiduously to business. He scarcely averaged 2 hours a day on the premises at Hanbridge. Indeed, the staff there had a sense of the unusual, inciting to unusual energy and devotion when word went round, "Governor's in the office with Mr. John." The councillor was always extremely busy with something other than his main enterprise. It was now reported, for example, that he was clearing vast sums out of picture palaces in Wigan and Warrington. Also, he was a religionist, being chairman of the local Church of England Village Mission Fund. And he was a politician, powerful in municipal affairs. And he was a reformer, who believed that by abolishing beer he could abolish the poverty of the poor, and acted accordingly. And lastly, he liked to enjoy himself. Everybody knew by sight his flying white whiskers and protruding ears, and he himself was well aware of the steady advertising value of those whiskers, of always being recognisable half a mile off. He met everybody unflinchingly, for he felt that he was invulnerable at all points and sure of a magnificent obituary. He was invariably treated with marked deference and respect, but he was not an honest man. He knew it, all his family knew it. In business everybody knew it, except a few nincompoops. Scarcely anyone trusted him. The peculiar fashion in which, when he was not present, people old Jacked him, this alone was enough to condemn a man of his years. Lastly, everybody knew that most of the Batchgrew family was of a piece with its head. Part 6. Now Rachel had formed a prejudice against old Batchgrew. She had formed it immutably in a single second of time. One glance at him in the street, and she had tried and condemned him, according to the summary justice of youth. She was in that stage of plenary and unhesitating wisdom when one not only can, but one must, divide the whole human race sharply into two categories, the sheep and the goats. And she had sentenced old Batchgrew to a place on the extreme left. It happened that she knew nothing against him, but she did not require evidence. She simply did not like that man. She italicised the end of the phrase bitingly to herself. And there was no appeal against the verdict. Angels could not have successfully interceded for him in the courts of her mind. He never guessed, in his aged self-sufficiency, that his case was hopeless with Rachel, nor even that the child had dared to have any opinion about him at all. She was about to slip off the pinafore apron and drop it onto the oak chest that stood in the lobby, but she thought with defiance, "Why should I take my pinafore off for him? I won't. He shan't see my nice frock. Let him see my pinafore. I am an independent woman, earning my own living, and why should I be ashamed of my pinafore? My pinafore is good enough for him." She also thought, "Let him wait," and went off into the kitchen to get the modern appliance of the match for lighting the gas in the lobby. When she had lighted the gas, she opened the front door with audacious but nervous deliberation, and the famous character impatiently walked straight in. He wore prominent loose black kid gloves and a thin black overcoat. Looking coolly at her, he said, "So you're the new lady companion, young miss? Well, I've heard rare accounts on ye, rare accounts on ye. Missus is in, I reckon?" His voice was extremely low, rich, and heavy. It descended on the silence like a thick lubricating oil that only reluctantly abandons the curves in which it falls, and Rachel answered faintly, tremulously, "Yes." No longer was she the independent woman, censorious and scornful, but a silly, timid little thing. Though she condemned herself savagely for schoolgirlishness, she could do nothing to arrest the swift change in her. The fact was, she was abashed, partly by the legendary importance of the renowned Batchgrew, but more by his physical presence. His mere presence was always disturbing, for, when he supervened into an environment, he had always the air